Moving in the period past 1950s, the first person that I want to talk about is Phillip Lewis. Phillip Lewis was a professor of landscape architecture and regional planning at the University of Wisconsin. In 1964, he developed a concept called quality corridors for Wisconsin. And he developed this by mapping significant environmental values and natural resource in the landscape. And what he discovered is that they tended to occur in corridor-like patterns. Corridors associated with hydrologic features such as rivers, streams, and wetlands. Corridors associated with topography, upland areas versus bottomland areas. Corridors associated with soils and geologic features, or corridors associated with land use, land cover, human settlement, and historical and cultural resources. He construed these corridors then as helping to identify significant resource values and guiding patterns for framing resource protection. Again, working with multiple sets of corridor systems in the landscape based upon hydrology, topography, vegetation, etc. So this is the final map that he produced for Wisconsin, showing his system of major environmental corridors and natural resource corridors, and areas to be managed then relative to the special values associated with them, and trying then to keep development occurring within the upland areas in between the corridors. In 1969, Ian McHarg, who was a professor of landscape architecture and regional planning at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote a book called Design with Nature, a very influential book, wherein he took Warren Manning's overlay analysis technique to identify critical environmental values and natural resources. He added to it a suitability criteria. The suitability criteria allowed him to develop, to identify areas having the greatest intrinsic suitability for various land uses based upon biological, physical, and cultural characteristics of the environment. He worked at the geographic scale of the entirety of Staten Island in New York City. I showed you these images earlier. They are from his first study to locate a major highway connecting the Verrazano Narrows with New Jersey across Staten Island. And he mapped a whole set of natural resource and environmental information, slopes, surface drainage, scenic values, residential values, and was able then to overlay these multiple value systems on top of one another to identify different corridor options and come up with his final recommendation then that maximized the intrinsic suitability of the landscape for, in this case, location of highways. He went on to do a comprehensive plan for all of Staten Island and started out by mapping various natural and cultural systems on the island, existing vegetation, surficial geology, soil drainage environments, existing land use, soil limitations based upon water table, etc., historic landmarks. Each of these maps then was overlaid on top of one another using the same overlay analysis system that Warren Manning used, and to begin to talk about areas of high suitability for conservation areas, areas of high suitability for recreation areas, and areas of high suitability for urbanization. So planners and decision makers then could understand the characteristics of the landscape and how well suited they were for urbanization versus conservation versus recreation, and make decisions about, for example, locating new urban areas based upon the collective suitabilities for conservation, recreation, and urbanization. Came up with a master plan then that allowed for recreation in areas most suited for recreation, urbanization in areas most suited for urbanization, conservation in areas most suitable for conservation. He expanded this concept to work with the entirety of the Potomac River Basin, flowing all the way from the Chesapeake Bay on the east up into Pennsylvania on the north and over into West Virginia on the west. Here he's mapping bedrock geology, slopes, soils, mineral resources, vegetative communities, wildlife, hydrology, and water quality. In other words, mapping various environmental systems in the landscape. And he developed what he called a compatibility matrix, where he could begin to talk about a given set of land uses, urban land uses, suburban residential uses, industrial uses, institutional uses, various kinds of mining uses, quarrying uses, agriculture, forestry, recreation, etc. And for each of those uses, he could talk about the compatibility of one use with another. For example, how compatible is it to have an urban use next to a reservoir? Or how compatible is it to have an urban use next to mining? How compatible is it to have suburban residential next to mining? So this allowed him to get a conceptual understanding of compatibility between these different land uses. And then the diagram on the far right-hand side of the matrix begins to tell him about the suitability of these different land uses for different parts of the landscape, because here he's talking about soil erosion, he's talking about climate, he's talking about water supply, he's talking about aquifer recharge areas, he's talking about slopes, soil characteristics, and for each of these different environmental elements he can begin to talk about how well suited they are for different kinds of land uses. So this map is really mapping land uses across to back and forth across one another, but then also mapping land uses to characteristics of the landscape. And it allowed him then to begin to talk about, for the entirety of the watershed, recreation suitability on the one hand, agriculture suitability, and urban suitability. And so decision makers then could make informed decisions about where to locate future urban areas based upon their intrinsic suitability, where to locate future agriculture based upon agricultural suitability, and they could begin to talk about the implications of putting one kind of use in an area that is more or less suited for it. His synthesis design came up with a comprehensive map that identified what he called optimal suitabilities for each of the different land use types. In 1979, Julius Pablos, who was a professor of landscape architecture and regional planning at the University of Massachusetts, developed a concept called regional landscape planning principles. He suggested 4 basic principles. Development should be discouraged in areas of significant natural and cultural resource value. Development should be discouraged in areas having natural and culturally induced hazards. Development should be encouraged in areas having highest inherent suitability. And finally, the ecological carrying capacity of the regional environment should not be exceeded. These first 3 ideas here of discouraging areas of significant development of significant natural and cultural resource values, discouraging areas in hazard areas, and encouraging areas that have highest suitability are very important concepts that you'll be exploring extensively throughout the course. Finally, the last project that I want to talk about is a project based upon a book written by Peter Calthorpe and William Fulton in 2001 called The Regional City. In this book, they identified the building blocks of regional landscape as including mixed-use centers containing jobs, housing, shopping, and services, special use districts dominated by a single use, preserves that protect critical environmental values or natural resources, and corridors that connect elements of the region and are defined by natural systems and transportation infrastructure. So in the Portland area then, he's mapping environmental systems, and then he's talking about idealized relationships between the different components of land use, and beginning to talk about then where do we place this idealized relationship between different types of land uses based upon the reality of environmental characteristics in the landscape. Thank you very much.